Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources here looking into that recent, well, frankly, wild exchange between the US and Russian leaders.
Hmm.
One calling the other crazy, the other firing back about being emotional. It absolutely grabbed headlines, didn't it?
It certainly did. Hard to miss that one.
So, our mission for this deep dive, using these sources you shared with us, is really to try and cut through some of that noise.
Right?
We want to look at what actually seemed to happen in this specific interaction, maybe put it into a bit of context, and see what it tells us, if anything, about the incredibly complex, often very tense relationship between the U.S. and Russia right now.
And it's crucial, as you said, that this particular verbal spat happened right after um, a really intense moment on the ground, a major Russian aerial attack on Ukraine.
Yeah, that context is key.
That's right. So before the public insults really started flying, there was significant military action. The sources you sent detail a really large-scale Russian aerial attack on Ukraine happening between, I think it was Sunday evening and Monday morning.
And the scale was pretty striking, wasn't it? What did the sources say?
Yeah, the numbers reported were
Yeah.
significant. We're talking figures like 355, maybe even up to 367 drones and missiles launched.
Wow.
Some sources even noted this might have been the largest drone attack Ukraine had faced up to that point.
And tragically, it wasn't just about the hardware, right? There were casualties.
Yes, absolutely. The reports from the sources indicated this attack resulted in deaths. Figures mentioned were around 10, possibly 13 people killed.
Hmm. And the explanations for the attack were, well, they were starkly different depending on who you ask, based on the sources.
Completely different narratives.
Yeah.
Russia apparently claimed it was a response to Ukrainian attacks on their, quote, social infrastructure, essentially civilian facilities.
Mm-hmm.
But Ukraine's President Zelensky saw it very differently. He called it an obvious political choice, a choice by Russia to continue the war and destroy lives, and argued it actually lacked military sense from a strategic viewpoint.
So just an immediate clash in how it was framed.
Exactly. A
Yeah.
real information battle right alongside the physical one.
And it was right on the heels of that, this huge attack, this devastation, that we saw the U.S. leader's reaction pop up, as reported in your sources.
Mm-hmm.
He went straight to social media Truth Social, specifically, and just directly called the Russian leader crazy.
Pretty blunt.
Very direct. And just adding another layer to the whole picture around this time, the sources also noted a significant statement coming out of Germany.
Oh, right, the arms restrictions.
Yeah. Germany's Chancellor Merz apparently stated that range restrictions on arms supplied to Ukraine were, quote, no longer in place.
And the implication there is pretty big.
It's potentially huge. It suggests Ukraine might now be able to use these weapons to hit military positions inside Russia,
Right.
with maybe just a few exceptions.
And the sources specifically mentioned speculation about possibly supplying Taurus missiles. Those have a substantial range, around 500 kilometers.
Which is notable because didn't Russia warn about that specifically?
Exactly. The sources reminded us that Russia had previously made it clear, issued a warning, that supplying those kinds of long-range missiles would be seen as a dangerous move.
Okay, so we have this massive attack, then the very sharp, crazy comment from the U.S. leader,
Mm-hmm.
and then comes the Kremlin's response. What did the sources say about that?
Well, according to the sources, the Kremlin's spokesperson, Peskov, he fired back. He described the U.S. leader as emotional, or maybe too emotional. One phrase used was emotional overload.
Emotional overload. Okay.
Yep.
So what's really interesting now is how that brief exchange, crazy versus emotional, got picked apart and interpreted in all the different sources you shared, especially in some of the online discussions they captured.
Oh, absolutely. It sparked such a range of analyses and, well, hot takes, really.
Like what? What kind of interpretations were out there?
Well, in one hand, you had this analysis suggesting that maybe the scale and, from Russia's view, the success of that big aerial offensive had sort of bruised the U.S. leader's ego.
Ah, okay.
And so his angry, crazy comment was maybe a reaction to feeling like his impotence was exposed by Putin's actions on the ground. That was one angle.
Interesting.
What else? Then, looking at some of the online comments reported in the sources, some people just saw Putin's emotional comment as a straight-up deliberate insult,
Like how so?
like interpreting it using really derogatory terms, essentially saying he was calling the U.S. leader things like, like bitch or pussy, a deliberate attempt to emasculate him, basically.
Wow. Okay, so very different from the ego bruising idea.
Very different. But then you also had interpretations, again, from online comments that viewed the whole thing almost theatrically, like it was just a play fight between them.
A play fight.
Yeah, or maybe like some weird dysfunctional family argument. One comment described it as, quote, "Mommy and Daddy are fighting."
Huh. So just dismissing it almost.
Kind of. And there's even some online speculation, though the sources noted it was maybe unlikely, that perhaps provoking the U.S. leader's ego like this might actually be a strange way to get more support for Ukraine.
How does that work?
The idea being that if he got angry enough, maybe he'd overreact and just decide, fine, give Ukraine everything they want, highlighting how much ego is seen as a driver in these interactions.
Right, the personality factor.
And another observation, frankly, a pretty critical one that was captured online, was this idea that with this particular U.S. leader, some people have just come to believe the truth is often the opposite of whatever he's publicly saying.
That's a strong claim.
It is, but it was a viewpoint noted in the sources. And interestingly, some of the online commentary also drew a comparison,
To what?
noting that this criticism of the U.S. leader being emotional kind of echoes past criticisms that were leveled specifically at female politicians like Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris about their perceived emotionality or lack thereof in politics.
Ah, so bringing in a gender dynamic comparison.
Exactly. It just sort of highlights how that word emotional gets used, maybe weaponized in political talk, and raises questions about double standards, even though here it was being applied to a male leader. It just shows the different lenses people bring to this stuff.
Yeah, fascinating range of takes. But this exchange, this sort of verbal blow-up, it didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It plays out against a much longer, much more complex history.
Absolutely not. It's crucial to see it in context, and the sources you provided give us a lot of that background.
So what's the big picture there?
Well, after the Cold War, there was this period, maybe brief, where there were genuine hopes for a strategic partnership, maybe Russia integrating more with the West.
Right, I remember that feeling.
But over time, that really it gradually gave way to increasing tension, mutual accusations. It really started picking up steam, the sources suggest, particularly since the 2010s.
And there were specific turning points.
Oh, definitely. The sources highlight key ones. Russia's actions in Ukraine back in 2014 are absolutely central.
Crimea and Donbass.
Exactly. The annexation of Crimea after that disputed referendum, and then backing the separatists in eastern Ukraine at the Donbass region, where the conflict has basically been grinding on for years now.
And Syria, too, right. That was another flashpoint mentioned.
Yes, Russia's military intervention in the Syrian civil war in 2015, Russia very clearly backed the Assad government while the U.S. was supporting various rebel groups. So you had this undeclared proxy conflict situation between them there, too.
So these tensions, they're not new, and they cover a lot of ground.
A huge amount. And Russia's whole approach to the post-Soviet states is still a massive area of friction. Sources note that Ukraine's independence, its sovereignty, seems particularly hard for Russia to fully accept.
Why is that? Is it just strategic or something deeper?
It seems deeper, tied into this historical narrative where some Russians traditionally see Ukrainians as very close, ethnically linked. Putin himself said in 2019 something like, Russians and Ukrainians are one people, one nation. And sources point to that deep historical narrative as a really crucial piece of why Ukraine, wanting to be independent, wanting closer ties with the West, is just so fundamentally difficult for Russia to swallow. It's a backdrop to everything.
And it's not just Ukraine, right? The sources mentioned other areas.
No, and not just Ukraine. We also see Russia maintaining troops and influence in places like Georgia, specifically in Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
The regions from the 2008 war?
Exactly. Regions Russia recognizes independent, where they keep military bases. There are still ongoing border issues there. And then in Moldova, you have Transnistria, that sort of breakaway region.
The Russian-backed strip of land on Ukraine's border.
Been outside Moldovan control for decades, and Russia still maintains troops there, too.
And beyond its immediate neighbors. Military posture, cyber stuff.
Yeah, the sources detail Russia's changing military posture, increasing its presence near NATO borders, holding large exercises that sometimes look like cover for moving troops around, plus the growing use of private military companies, like Wagner, in various conflicts.
Okay, and the cyber and influence campaigns, that's a big one, too.
Huge. Sources mention targeting elections in other countries, spreading disinformation through state-funded outlets like RT, Sputnik. trying to sow discord.
Any specific examples mentioned?
Yeah, the SolarWinds cyber attack was brought up as a major example.
Yeah.
Basically, these operations seem designed to undermine opponents and push narratives that favor Russia's interests.
So, faced with all this, what has the U.S. response looked like over time, according to the sources?
Well, it's been layered. The U.S. has definitely increased its military presence back in Europe, worked more closely with NATO allies, and also with countries outside NATO.
Like Ukraine and Georgia.
Precisely. Providing significant aid, including lethal weapons, specifically because they faced Russian aggression and, parts of their territory are occupied.
And sanctions, that seems like a major tool.
A very significant tool, yes. The U.S. has imposed just a wide array of sanctions on Russia itself and on many Russian individuals, companies, entities.
For what kinds of things?
For various actions the U.S. calls malign activities.
Hmm.
Things related to Ukraine, obviously, but also documented human rights abuses, election interference, chemical weapons attacks like Salisbury, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. It's a long list.
It sounds incredibly complex and strained. Is there any cooperation mentioned?
It's worth noting, yeah, that even with all this tension, the sources did indicate that both sides have, at various points, kind of acknowledged a need for some engagement on certain issues where interests might align, like arms control, maybe counterterrorism.
But with limited success.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Past efforts haven't really managed to bridge the much wider divide.
And are the U.S. and Europe always on the same page about how to deal with Russia?
Not entirely. Sources touched on that too. There are different perspectives. Some in the U.S. and Europe see Russia mainly as a potential threat, needing strong military deterrence and support for countries on Russia's borders.
The containment view? Sort of.
Kind of. Others lean towards a more pragmatic approach,
Oh.
maybe emphasizing commercial ties, energy links, and arguing that Russia is simply too big to isolate or ignore, that you have to engage on some level.
Right. Different schools of thought. Okay, so bringing it back to the listener, why should you care about this specific spat, this crazy versus emotional thing, and all this broader context we've been discussing? Well, look, understanding interactions like this isn't just about following political drama or, who said what about whom, although that's certainly part of the story.
Right.
It's really a window, sometimes a pretty stark one, into the ongoing strategic competition and those deep underlying tensions between two major global powers.
And these things have real-world impacts, don't they?
Absolutely. These kinds of interactions and the whole historical context they come from, they influence international security, they shape how alliances like NATO think and act, they can ripple out and affect global energy markets, and they definitely fuel the incredibly complicated information environment we all have to navigate every single day.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
So knowing this history, understanding the different perspectives, being able to place specific events like that attack on Ukraine or the German statement about arms ranges into that bigger picture, it really helps you, listener, cut through the noise, cut through the constant overload, and become hopefully more genuinely well-informed about these critical world events that honestly do affect everyone.
It helps them make sense of the headlines.
Exactly. So just to recap quickly, in this deep dive, we've looked at that recent, pretty sharp public exchange between the U.S. and Russian leaders.
The crazy and emotional comments.
Right. We put it in the immediate context of that large-scale Russian attack on Ukraine that happened right before. We explored the various reactions and interpretations this whole thing sparked, from personal insult to maybe just political theater.
Yeah, the whole range.
And then we broadened out, looked at the longer, much more tense history of U.S.-Russia relations, drawing on all that rich detail from the sources you shared.
It's a lot to take in, that history.
It really is. So maybe a final thought for you to mull over as you think about all this.
Okay.
Consider just how deeply these things, the personal dynamics between leaders, maybe ego, maybe emotion, interact with these powerful, long-held historical narratives about national identity, about spheres of influence, how that shapes global interactions right now.
The personal and the historical combined.
Yeah. And what does that really mean for understanding international stability today? Especially when, as some sources seem to suggest, those old mechanisms, the safeguards that maybe existed during the Cold War for managing escalation, well, maybe they just aren't as present or effective anymore.
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
It really is a complex picture, isn't it? Layers upon layers of history and ongoing
That's
tensions.
something to keep thinking about.